Story 1. The Stranger at the Window. It was a blizzard-filled December night when Anne, a young woman living alone in a remote cabin in upstate New York, experienced a nightmare she would never forget. The cabin was miles away from the nearest neighbor, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forests. Anne enjoyed the solitude, using the quiet winter months to work on her writing. But that winter was harsher than usual, with snowdrifts piling up and the temperature dipping far below freezing. On one particularly frigid night, the snowstorm outside was so intense that it felt as if the wind were trying to batter down the walls of her little cabin. Wrapped in a blanket, Anne sat by the fire, lost in a book when she heard it. 3 loud knocks on the front window. She froze. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? The closest road was completely snowed in, and no one would make the trek to her cabin in these conditions. Heart pounding, she stood up and hesitantly approached the window. What she saw made her blood run cold. Standing just outside the window was a man. His clothes were ragged, his face pale, and his eyes wide with desperation. He was covered in snow. His lips blue from the cold. He didn't speak. He just stared at her through the frosted glass. Anne didn't know what to do. Should she let him in? Maybe he was in danger, lost in the storm, needing shelter. But something about the way he looked, his stillness, the unnatural silence, made her hesitate. She moved closer to the window, but when she blinked, the man was gone. Rushing to the front door, she flung it open, calling out into the howling wind, "Hello? Do you need help?" But there was no response and no sign of any footprints in the snow. The entire landscape was untouched, as if no one had ever been there. Shaken, Anne locked the door and sat by the fire, trying to convince herself she had imagined the whole thing. But the night wasn't over. Around midnight, she heard the knocks again, 3 sharp taps at the window. This time, she didn't get up. She knew that whatever was outside wasn't human. The next morning, she found large footprints circling the cabin in the snow. They led up to the window, where the man had stood, but they never led away. Story 2. The Specter of Frostbite Lake. In the winter of 2007, a group of college students from Minnesota planned a winter camping trip near Frostbite Lake, a desolate spot deep in the woods. Known for its harsh winters and remote location, Frostbite Lake was notorious for its treacherous ice and eerie folklore, but that only added to the thrill of the trip. The group, 5 in total, set up their tents by the frozen lake, hoping for a weekend of adventure, sledding, and ice fishing. On the second night of the trip, a storm blew in, dropping temperatures to well below zero and covering the campsite in several feet of snow. The wind howled relentlessly, and the cold was so intense that even sitting around the campfire felt futile. Around midnight, they heard it, a distant mournful wail echoing across the lake. At first, they thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder, it became clear that it was something else, something alive. One of the campers, Jake, insisted it was a coyote or maybe a wolf, but the sound wasn't animalistic. It was human, a low, anguished cry that sent shivers down their spines. They huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sound. The wailing continued throughout the night, growing closer and more distinct. At around 3 a.m., one of the campers, Mia, couldn't take it anymore. She suggested they check it out just in case someone was lost in the storm. Against their better judgment, 3 of them grabbed flashlights and set off toward the lake, following the noise. As they approached the shore, they saw something on the ice, a figure, hunched and unmoving, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. It looked like a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her long hair blowing wildly in the wind. She was standing in the middle of the frozen lake, her back to them, swaying slightly, as if in a trance. "Are you okay?" Jake shouted, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge them. Against Mia's protests, Jake began walking out onto the ice, calling to the figure. He was halfway across the lake when it turned around. Her face was grotesque, pale and sunken, with hollow black eyes. She opened her mouth, letting out a bone-chilling scream that reverberated across the lake. Panicking, Jake tried to run, but the ice beneath him cracked. Within seconds, he plunged into the freezing water. The others ran to the shore, shouting his name, but by the time they reached him, Jake was gone, swallowed by the icy depths. When they finally called for help the next morning, search and rescue teams combed the area. Jake's body was never recovered, and the woman on the ice was never seen again. Locals believe the ghostly figure is that of a woman who drowned in the lake decades ago, cursed to wander its frozen surface, searching for others to drag into the icy depths. Story 3. The Cabin in the Mountains. This final story takes place in the winter of 2012, deep in the Colorado Rockies. A man named Luke, an avid outdoorsman, had rented a remote cabin for a week of snowshoeing and solitude. The cabin was far from civilization, accessible only by a narrow, snow-covered trail. Luke had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to escape the city and lose himself in the peace of the mountains. The first few days were perfect. The snow was fresh, the air crisp, and the silence absolute. But on the third night, everything changed. As Luke was preparing to go to bed, he heard a soft tapping on the front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest town was miles away, and the trail to the cabin was treacherous, especially in the winter. Hesitant, he opened the door to find nothing but darkness and falling snow. Brushing it off as a branch hitting the door in the wind, he closed it and went to bed. But the tapping returned, this time louder and more insistent. Luke grabbed a flashlight and opened the door again. This time, he noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the door, but none leading away. The tapping continued for hours, now coming from the windows and walls as well. Luke was terrified, but there was nowhere to go. He was snowed in, trapped miles from help. He tried to sleep, but the sound kept him awake, growing louder and more erratic, as if something, or someone, was trying to get inside. The next morning, the footprints were gone, erased by the snow. But Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He packed up and left the cabin that same day, abandoning his trip. Later, when he told his story to the locals, they looked at him with a mix of fear and understanding. "You're not the first," one of them said. "That cabin's been empty for years. People hear strange things out there, footsteps, knocking. It's like the mountain doesn't want you there." Luke never went back. Winter has a way of amplifying our deepest fears, turning the peaceful silence of snow into something far more sinister. Whether it's a phantom figure on a frozen lake, a mysterious stranger at the window, or something unknown tapping at your door, the cold brings with it a chill that lingers long after the snow is melted. So, as you settle in for a cold December night, remember these stories and maybe keep the lights on. You never know what might be out there, waiting in the snow.